Hello and welcome back to Everybody Hates Your Brand. Today's episode features an interview with Angela Harding. Angela is a veteran of the video games industry, having spent over 19 years working at Activision Blizzard. She held many roles there, her last being Vice President for EMEA for the legendary and enduring Call of Duty franchise. But she moved on from that a year or so ago to co-found Inclusive People, whose mission is to empower technology organisations to unlock their greatest asset, their people. Join us as we chat through everything from how video games promotion has moved on into her latest venture and the real importance of diversity and inclusion in today's world. So, as I said in the intro, I am delighted to be joined by Angela Harding. Angela, welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Rob.
It's delightful to have you. Thank you for coming on. It is traditional in these parts to start any interview with what I call the credibility section, which is where my guest details their history and their career and essentially where they're coming from so that listeners understand you and your expertise and what it is you do. So if you wouldn't mind giving us a bit of an intro to yourself and your career, that would be fabulous, please.
I love that it's called credibility, first of all. I mean, I think I've blown my credibility on multiple occasions while I've been active.
People don't know that. The people listening don't necessarily know that yet.
So I think
do now.
Rub that off. Like I didn't say that. I've never blown my credibility. Actually, I am originally a commercial person. So my career has been coming up through the sales and commercial businesses. I've been in gaming for the past 20 years, but actually prior to that, I actually started my career in toys, which in many respects is fairly similar in terms of how the industry is. And, you do see quite a bit of crossover. So I started in toys, working in sales. It was when there were retailers like Woolworths, a very, very different landscape in retailing. And, for me, it was a big eureka moment that I'd come out of university with absolutely no idea what I wanted to do, in my early 20s, needing to earn some money. And I discovered sales and account management. And I was like, this is certainly me. So I went up, I moved from working for Hasbro to working for a photographic company. Again, another industry that is extremely different today, eventually ending up in Kodak. So it was a digital challenge that we've all experienced in gaming, but on a completely different scale. And then from there, I ended up taking a role in sales with Activision. And at that point, it was 2005. We were selling onto PS2. It was very exciting. This PS2 was still reasonably fresh. And I came in just as Activision was launching some fairly memorable titles. So there was Call of Duty 2, the number one attached title even then on Xbox. And there were titles Gun, True Crime. So it was an interesting introduction to the industry. We had a very challenging Christmas. There were a lot of lessons learned, and Activision at that point was very much not like what Activision is today. There weren't formalized processes. It felt very much like a startup in entertainment. And I joined thinking, probably I'll be with this company for 3 or 4 years, and then I'll change. And that really had been the pattern of my career to that point. And I ended up obviously staying for almost 20 years, 19, 20 years. And actually during that time, and a big reason and a big part of why I ended up staying was how the industry feels like you're working for a new company, really almost every couple of years. Everything sort of so fundamentally changes in terms of how you do things, who you're working with. And so, during that period of time in my career within Activision, obviously I started within sales, but my final role before I left was Vice President for Call of Duty for EMEA and also head of the commercial business for EMEA as well. And weirdly, I don't think it was ever, my aspiration was to reach the top of the commercial Christmas tree, shall we say, when I joined Activision. I never really had aspirations to be in product management or to work on that side of it. But I think that just shows how there were certainly times within my career where I've gone in directions that have been completely unexpected to me and probably everybody else. But, it's great. It makes who you are, good experiences, new things. And I think even when I look at where I am today, so I left Activision a year ago and started a company called Inclusive People with the head of HR who happened to leave at the same time as me. And that has been really that is the brainchild of some of the things that I was involved with later on in my time in Activision. So I was heavily involved with the Women's Network. I think most people will appreciate coming from the games industry that it isn't exactly the sort of most gender diverse industry to work in. And so I have heavily advocated for better gender representation and in particular better gender representation in leadership, because I think that's where a lot of it needs to change. And so I'd been heavily involved with the Women's Network over the last few years, and actually culminating before I left Activision Blizzard King, I was actually their global executive sponsor for the Women's Network across Activision Blizzard and King. So that has been something that I wouldn't necessarily have thought would be my path if you'd asked me a few years ago. It was something I felt strongly about and something I had a passion for, but has actually now become, as we'll discuss probably later, has become a big part of what I do today.
Well, brilliant. Thank you very much. I think what you've kind of talked about there is the conversation today is going to be essentially a tale of two halves. One section we're going to focus a little bit more on the video games industry, and then the sort of bulk of it we're going to talk about your new venture and why it's important. And you've kind of touched on that a little bit already, which is great. But I was thinking about this when I was writing the questions. We were discussing it beforehand, that if you were there from 2005 to 2024 at Activision, yeah, which means, as you said, you started with PS2 and Xbox and GameCube. And then I think you've seen 3 console generations since then, roughly. So PS3, PS4, PS5, and then the Xbox equivalents. And a couple of Nintendo doing their own thing at the times at which Nintendo want to do things, because that's how Nintendo do it. You've seen online gaming grow from being almost like a niche thing to this dominant way of doing things. You've seen box products decline in sales, about 500 Call of Duty launches, and a whole different sort of supportive ecosystem grow up around big games and streamers. So it would be remiss if I didn't ask a couple of questions about that change. And I think, having worked briefly in the industry myself, the thing that struck me the most, and especially as a CRM loyalty guy, the advent of games as a service, so whether that's free to play or subscription based, feels like it's a very different business model to the olden days of go into a store, buy a box, come back with a box. At most, maybe a bit of DLC, but it was kind of when we first started, that's how it was. And you think about games like that are still going, like Fortnite and Warzone, and now new stuff like Dune Awakening. And we kind of talk about this idea of an active player base and how do you monetize that player base, whether that's through microtransactions for cosmetics or new content or whatever it is. So you're kind of going from buying a box to buying, hopefully, like a revenue stream, if you like. So the question is this: as that change happened over time, how has it changed how publishers think about how they measure and monitor success? And has that changed the strategies for promotional strategies? And you always used to be about big bang, day one, midnight launches, as many pre-orders as you can get, that kind of stuff. Has that changed, and how has the landscape changed as that idea of more of an ongoing relationship has become more pervasive?
Yeah, and do you know an answer? Surprisingly, there are probably still a number of things that are the same, and I think that isn't necessarily an industry thing. That's I'm speaking more from an Activision and really from a Call of Duty perspective. So I think you'd be surprised that there are a few things that are actually the same. That pre-order, pre-purchase intent is still a key metric, but obviously fundamentally gaming and what gaming was in 2005 versus what it is now in 2025 is so incredibly different. So, if we take gun and true crime, for example, when I joined, they had huge amounts of marketing budget. I can't remember now. I mean, that amounts have been wiped from my mind. But they're relative to the launches, there were huge amounts of spend put against those titles, and I think as they weren't commercially successful, and there was a huge amount of problems cleaning them up when we moved into the post-Christmas period. And one of the key learnings at that point in time was to release a title without enough pre-awareness and pre-orders is an utter disaster, right? So, the key learning was media alone will not do it for you. You need to have done the work, and you need to have had a really strong campaign up until you launch. That is still a significant part of the market, and it's still a significant part of the Call of Duty business, even saying that. And that kind of need for pre-orders and pre-awareness and having a successful campaign from reveal to launch hasn't gone away. So, that still exists. However, the model isn't the same. There wasn't mobile, there wasn't Warzone, none of those things obviously existed 20 years ago. And so what that means is you just have the addition of lots and lots and lots of other metrics. So yes, on the full game, you might still be tracking to pre-orders and pre-awareness and intent, and that is still very relevant. However, on top of that, because you have experiences on mobile and you have experiences on Warzone, you're also tracking DAUs and MAUs and lifetime value and average revenue per user. And, so there are just a whole sea of new metrics that you're tracking. And, even when you look at the business and how the business has changed, it used to be that we could almost, as long as we didn't have anything to clean up in January, you would have a reasonably quiet first few months of the year in publishing, because you would absolutely work yourself to death getting everything out for Q4, and then you would have like a mini breakdown at the beginning of the year to get over it, and then you'd start that cycle again of like building, to an insane launch at the end of the year, and then recovery afterwards. However, now the seasonality has completely changed. The revenue used to be 80-20. It was like 80% in the last few months of the year, and the rest of the year was just stuff ticking over. Whereas now the seasonality of revenue is pretty evenly spread throughout the year. It's, as an industry, it means that it's a lot more relentless. There aren't those troughs of time. For Call of Duty, yes, you'll have a game release still every year, and the game release is still a very important part of the Call of Duty business. However, there are, on top of that, Warzone is offering continuous seasons, and there are even more frequent drops in mobile to appeal to that audience. So those experiences are effectively relentless.
Yeah. Does that change from a thinking about it, kind of classical marketing theory? Does that change the channels that you're using? So, like, has things like CRM and defining CRM broadly as like in-app messaging, in-game messaging, app stuff, has that become a bigger part of the business as a way of driving that, do you think?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it was always a very important part of the business. I mean, another key metric is always going to be retention, on whatever platform. And retention is all the more important when you are in a world of persistent experiences. And, by maintaining people in the game, you're able to do things like, who would have thought 20 years ago? I mean, you wouldn't have been able to do it. You didn't even have the technology to reveal the next game in the current. I mean, you couldn't, but it means that there are a whole new world of opportunities for marketing, because you have a persistent customer base, but also a whole new world of challenges because you have a persistent customer base.
Yes, and social media is a much bigger thing than it was in 2005, and they can voice their opinions very strongly, whether it on Reddit or I refuse to call it the new name on Twitter or wherever it may be.
Yeah. And those things, the player has always been, it's always been around the player, and the player has always been central to everything that certainly was done with things like Call of Duty. And that doesn't change. But obviously, the community now has it used to be that you would broadcast to the community, whereas now it means that it's a dialogue. And it brings, I think everyone will have seen there's been repeated restructures and changes really across the industry. And it's because there have been, if you think about how the industry has evolved, 20 years ago, it was a retail industry, and actually you would be selling. So in terms of who you were communicating to as a customer, you would be communicating to the end customer, and you would be wanting to drive that, especially through sort of pre-orders and pre-awareness. But actually, a lot of your media mix would have been directed at gifters because it was pivotal to hit gifters in that key period of the year, and it was, and retail was an important way to do that. Whereas flick to where we are now, actually, the scale of the retail business, if we take the UK, is relatively small. For the UK and the US, where you see much more digitally advanced markets, there are different, in France and places like Italy, you do see that there's still a reasonably big physical market. However, certainly, in the UK and the US, actually they've switched to being very much more digital markets. And so obviously your focus now is more on the end player as opposed to that gifting audience, which influences then what you might do in terms of promotional strategies and things like that.
And there's a whole, we won't get into this one because it's a whole can of worms, but you think about things like Game Pass and what that's done to the video games or PlayStation Plus, although obviously Sony tend not to do day one releases on PlayStation Plus, but that's been a huge thing. I think one of the other seismic shifts, which I think nobody would have predicted 20 years ago, is streaming and how important video game streamers, whether that's on Twitch or YouTube or even just video games content on YouTube, has become. It can be a real plus for a brand, I think, and to work with. It can also be a minus depending on how the game goes and the streamer you pick, which there's been some issues there historically with certain names that have maybe not showered themselves in glory, should we say politely. So from your perspective, what or how did Activision, I guess, the Call of Duty, look at the role of streamers? What was their role in the channels, and how were you trying to use them? And did that has the mix money shifted away from other channels into streamers, or did you just have to find a bunch of extra money and whack streaming on top?
Yeah, I'll answer probably in reverse order this time. I think, on the money side, everything has changed fundamentally in terms of how the game is marketed. Like I say, 20 years ago, it was very much a traditional media mix, and all your money was spent in that final quarter of the year. You had some doing your pre-awareness and build to drive your pre-orders, but actually the majority of the spend was on traditional linear media, and it was spent in that final period of the year around launch. Whereas now, there are so many different ways in which you're looking at spend against the franchise. Especially in the case of Call of Duty, there's always a halo effect. We've seen, actually you might be spending against the full game for that year, but it will impact actually what happens across the franchise. But it's very, in terms of how it's split and weighted, it's fundamentally different. And the business is fundamentally different since the launch of Warzone and mobile. It's a completely different style and shape of business to what it was when it was just a full game. So yes, I would say it's not that it's necessarily it's the mix has changed. I wouldn't necessarily look at the amount. The amount isn't so relevant because it's not a like for like business. Um, it's the fact that you see a very, very different mix. And probably not surprisingly, the mix has shifted away from traditional media. And that's just reflective of how you reach your players. And it's to be able to reach them more efficiently digitally and through social media. It just makes a lot more sense to be reaching your players in that way. And the role of streamers is very much in driving engagement. And we would, if you look back at what might have been done historically, the things like we would do early access, for example, with streamers. And it's just that it's evolved, because historically early access would have been done, but it would have been done with games industry press. Whereas now it's like there is still a contingent of games industry press, but it's games industry press and streamers. So it's very much an evolution of, probably I see it as like a natural evolution, and they have become, I guess, a way of accessing the community as well and working with the community.
It's an interesting. I was on a because I was doing nothing else. I was on a Call of Duty subreddit the other day, and there was a conversation about actually streamers are great, but what they want out of the game is different to what the players want out of the game to a degree. So streamers want loads of kills, loads of action, all that kind of stuff. And the most recent Warzone has kind of gone back a little bit. I think I haven't played it. I played a lot of the Warzones, but I haven't played the most recent one. Has become a bit more of a battle royale. It's a bit more slower paced, and which is what I like. That's my kind of game. And there's a lot of talk about, well, the streamers want it quicker, faster, blah, 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 and don't listen to the streamers, Activision, and all that kind of stuff. So there's a really interesting dynamic, I think, in that context, that the streamers aren't the players, but they're a way to access the players, I suppose.
Yeah, and then it's a way to access, but it's not an exclusive way. I think I think the world is so much more complex in many ways now, isn't it? It was 20 years ago, it was a lot easier. Whereas now it's a lot more fragmented. So you might have just looked at a handful of different media options, whereas now a launch plan involves multiple different avenues, and you're having to cover so many more bases. But it's actually just reflective of the fact that 20 years ago somebody would have sat and watched TV and just been watching TV, and they would have watched through the ads. They wouldn't necessarily be fast forwarding through the ads. Whereas today, if they actually, they're probably not watching TV, they're probably watching something through Netflix, and they are probably on at least a couple of devices at the same time.
They're watching the screen on the wall because it's the best way to watch content, but they're watching it through YouTube Premium or, as you said, Netflix or whatever it might be. Unless there's some crazy live event, like I'm a big NFL fan, the Super Bowl still matters, and all that kind of stuff. But yeah, it's interesting. Well, you talked about now, so let's talk about your new venture, because I think this is really, really interesting and really important work that you're doing. So you talk about it's Inclusive People is the name of the company. I would love for you to give us you've talked a little bit about how you came out of Activision and started this, but I'm really interested in the origin story and the kind of catalyst for why you felt strongly enough that Inclusive People was something that was needed, and you left somewhere where you've been for so long to start this thing. So I'm kind of that's quite a big change in your career. So I'm kind of interested as to what the major catalyst was.
Yeah, and they're not. I would say they're mutually exclusive as decisions. One didn't necessarily catalyze the other, and I think I never joined Activision. Like I think I said at the beginning, I never joined Activision thinking that I would be here for anything longer than 3 or 4 years. So I've been here a lot longer than I planned. And, so my intention was never to stay. But I think with everything that's happened, with the changes with Microsoft, it became just a good time for me to be able to leave, and I felt in the right space that the company was changing. And I also felt personally this was the right time for me to leave. And as it happened, somebody else was going through a similar kind of light bulb moment. She hadn't been with Activision so long, but she had a similar desire to leave and do something different at the same time. And her name was Charlotte Biggood, and she was the head of HR for Activision Blizzard EMEA. And we both, so we had both decided to leave, and we got chatting, and we both have a great passion. We worked together as part of the leadership team for the EMEA Activision Blizzard business, and we'd both been very big advocates around inclusion and driving a diversity agenda. And actually, we got chatting. We realised that when we were leaving Activision, it was leaving a hole in terms of representation, like gender representation. So we came upon the idea of, why don't we do something? We both feel strongly about this. Why don't we do something together? Actually, we could bring our different skill sets to actually try and change something. So she's got the traditional HR skills, and I am a commercial leader. So it's that blend of, we don't just want to talk about this. We actually want to see results, and we want to see action. And so we came together, and I think one of the best things about doing it was that actually we've been able to work with a lot of the team still at Activision Blizzard. So we've worked with a number of the team, coaching and doing people culture work. So that's, from a continuity perspective, that's been great to start our business, and actually to have the ability to still be working with some of the fantastic people that we had before.
Well, I think as we talked about before the podcast, I think this, like, video games obviously is where you've been for a while, so it makes sense for that to be a beachhead. But I also think it makes sense given, whilst the games industry has made progress over the years in terms of gender representation and diversity and all those kind of things, it remains a very male dominated industry, both, I think, publisher, developer, even streaming, that kind of stuff. Although that, again, I think that's improving and changing, and has been shown to can be quite a toxic place for women and LGBTQ individuals. And so, from your perspective and sort of the purpose of inclusive people, if you like, what do you see as the paths to improving that situation? Is it just greater representation in the developers and publishers? Is it something else? What do you, and I guess this kind of like plays into what the purpose of inclusive people is, and how you're trying to sort of make those changes, I guess.
Yeah. And look, I think the starting point is that when you look at gamers are pretty much 50-50 in terms of gender representation. It's a pretty equal split. However, actually, when you look at the makeup of the industry, there is such a long way to go. And I don't know that representation is definitely moving in the right direction. I think potentially with the move to digital, I think that has impacted to some extent the numbers of females that we see in representation and leadership. I don't think it's been as good. And, there will be, UK are running another census. We'll see the result when that comes through. However, as things stand at the moment, around 30% of the workforce is identify as women. And probably more concerningly, there are stats like, only 16% of gaming executives in the UK are women. I mean, that's a worrying figure. And that translates into figures like, 68% of game characters are male. And when you look at, how they're pushing this, only 18% of game protagonists are female.
Yeah, and yet people are ridiculously up in arms, woke agenda, whatever nonsense they're spouting, just because Aloy from Horizon Forbidden West looks a certain way, or the person from the new Star Wars Ubisoft game. The numbers don't bear out the outrage at all.
No, and I think that, there are many reasons why, this isn't just about an agenda where you say, it's about, we need to do it because it's the right thing to do. I mean, yes, it is the right thing to do, but that really isn't what it's all about. Actually, you need to look at the bigger picture and say, when, as an industry, we're not performing as well as we could do commercially by not appealing to the audience. We've got the players, but they're not spending. I mean, there was one thing, if we could move the women to be spending on a par with men, so just move the average spend in the UK of women to men, I mean, you could be looking at over 700 million in additional revenue for the games industry. I mean, that would be like boosting it by almost 10%. Like, and that's just moving. That's not saying we're going to get more women into the game. That's just saying we're just going to try and get them to spend on par with men. And I think the other thing, which is in many ways is possibly even a bigger reason to be doing this, is that increasingly more and more of the household spend is being controlled, discretionary household spend is being controlled by women. And by 2030, something like 75% of global household spend will be controlled by women. So it doesn't make any sense, as an industry, not to be catering and making sure that we have everything that we need to optimize that audience. And I think going back to, what do we need to do about it to make that happen? I see it. For the UK market, there are probably 3 areas that we need to double down on. The first is that there needs to be more women in leadership, because they need to be able to lift up and to be pushing those agendas. There need to be more women startups and more women-led businesses. There was a recent report, the Rose Review by the Treasury, had highlighted that actually, if they could get women to start and scale businesses at the same rate as men in the UK, that would be worth, and this isn't just games, obviously, but generally, that would be worth 250 billion to the UK. So, for the games industry, it's obviously it's imperative that we also have women starting and scaling businesses. There are no stats at the moment as to what it is, but it's believed to be very, very small. And then the third area is like, how do you tackle toxicity? So how are you making sure that actually, women are comfortable and happy in places that they are? And again, that will be tackled really if you get the leadership right. Then you're going to end up tackling some of those issues.
100%. I think this is a really important conversation, especially given what's happening across the pond in the US and the sort of the Trump administration's war on DE&I has become a kind of like a dirty word over there. And I kind of look at it, how has that impacted what you're doing? Like, have people become more resolute? No, okay, we're gonna do this. This is really important. Or has it been a rollback? I know Take-Two have maybe changed a few things recently in relation to removing DE&I. Has it been a weirdly a force for good, or in terms of promoting DE&I, or has it been bad? What have you noticed?
I don't think it's not good. I don't think that the negative attention has been good, but I think you also need to be very clear at how you look at what's going on, and the UK is very different from the US. And clearly in the US they had affirmative action, and that just wouldn't have been legal. I mean, it isn't legal in the UK. We have positive action in the UK, and we can support people to get to the right levels to be able to be applicable for roles. We couldn't, you can't discriminate. You can't discriminate against somebody in the UK to put a quota through. So I don't think that there's a lot of understanding of, a lot of broad understanding of how different the US was. And maybe in some ways the US will end up where the UK is. But, I think undeniably there is a challenge around US companies feeling having concerns about spending on DE&I or being publicly seen to be spending on DE&I. However, that hasn't been, when you look at how companies have responded, there hasn't been a uniform response. So yes, you have seen some companies, and maybe, it's difficult times. It's an easy bucket to pull with an excuse. But then you have also seen other companies doubling down and affirming their, what they're doing in the DE&I space. And, I think there are certainly companies like Microsoft who have said that it's just part of the way that they do business. It can't be separated. It's part of the way they do business already. And, even sort of businesses like Coca-Cola, for example, who continue to state that, their aspiration is to have 50% is to have like 50% representation for women on their board and in their leadership by 2030. So it's not all bad, but it's not a good thing that it's
for me, I was wondering if it had created a positive backlash against it almost. It's like, well, no, we're going to keep, this is important. We're going to keep doing this. And another one that stands out to me is, obviously Costco, is another great example of people standing up against that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
I agree with you. I think it has been bad. I just wonder if there were some people who were just using it as a catalyst to kind of it would increase resolve. Essentially, I guess is what I was.
Yeah, and I think that there are people that have used it as a way to cut spend at a time that maybe might have cut spend anyway, but it's a good excuse. And then there are other companies who have affirmed their support, and I think within the UK, it's very clear. You have to adhere to the UK. For businesses that are operating here, then they need to adhere to the regulations. They need to be making sure that wherever possible, they are looking at quality training and things like that. So it's it's a different regulatory environment, and it's a watch out as well. For Gen Z, Forbes had said 75% of Gen Z, they just think that diversity is a given, and they would reconsider a job offer if there was an issue around it. So that's 75% of that generation. So whilst it might be okay for some of the other generations, when it comes to hiring and bringing in key talent, this will be a given.
As a Gen Xer myself, I'm with them on this one. I think there are certain brands now know that I wouldn't touch anymore, for example. So fingers crossed it continues that way, and that people that kind of attitude stays with them as they grow and grow older.
I certainly hope so, and I think we feel that there is not, it shouldn't just be about that it's the right thing to do. Well, it should be about that it's the right thing to do, but actually, you shouldn't be forgetting that the reason why we do this is because we want to be appealing to we want to be appealing to as many people in the market.
Maximize your commercial opportunity. I think marrying the I wrote down here marrying the moral case and the capitalist case, for a better way of putting it, is a really potent thing. Well, look, it's been fantastic to chat to you. We have one last question, which we ask all of our guests, which regular listeners will know is the Marketing Room 101 question. So we provide our guests an opportunity to suggest something that they despise, annoys them, whatever it might be within marketing or just in business in general, and plead their case for why that should be in Everybody Hates Your Brand Marketing Room 101. So what would your selection be? What would be your suggestion to try and get into Room 101?
So, I come from commercial. So mine isn't going to be a marketing one. Mine is going to be very much a commercial one. And, something that probably still, sends shivers down my spine is lean in. Lean in.
Lean in.
Yeah.
Expand your
So
expand.
lean in always used to be what we were told, when we were selling something and it wasn't what the it wasn't what the people at the top wanted it to be, it would be told you need to lean in. And what this means, we want you to use aggressive sales techniques to put in loads more than you need to put in.
Yes, that's not a great ideal, is it? Yeah, lean in. You got to lean into it. Okay, I think that's a very good one, and I think it's one of those things. I do think, and you would know this more than me because of your seniority at Activision, but I've always thought that at a certain point, I don't know what level in a hierarchy it happens, that cause and effect don't seem to apply anymore. That we can't do this because of this. Well, I'll just make it happen. I'm like, no. Just saying that doesn't mean it's going to happen. There's you know what I mean? You can't just, that's not leadership, saying get it done or lean in.
And I think the conversations were more along the lines of, this needs to happen. End of.
Oh God. It's such a.
You come back and you tell me how you're going to make this happen.
It's fine, I think, to challenge and to push back, but at a certain point, it's like, okay, we're going to have to do something different here, or maybe these numbers aren't right, or whatever it is. Anyway, I think it's a very good one because I've not necessarily been the phrase "lean in," but that idea of no, you have to make it happen without any extra help or any of that kind of stuff. I think is something that a lot of people will have experienced.
It suggests that it's quite soft, doesn't it? I mean, lean doesn't say push or shove or get this in. Lean suggests, just a little nudge.
Yeah, just a little nudge. Well, look, that's definitely going into Marketing Room 101. I don't think I need to get more selective. I don't think I've not let something in yet. And there needs to be. I need to be a bit more aggressive. But I need to lean into it more. Yeah. But that's definitely going in because it's setting alarm bells ringing from my history as well. So, brilliant. Well, look, Angela, thank you so much for spending the time to come on Everybody Hates Your Brand and chat to us today. We really appreciate having you on.
Thanks, Rob, and thanks for listening to me.
Well, I hope you enjoyed that sort of two-parter conversation around video games and from video games into diversity. The two are very sort of interlinked at the moment. As you might have noticed, we've increased the frequency slightly of podcast production. Hopefully we can continue to keep that up. Please keep subscribing, keep listening, keep reviewing. If you wouldn't mind rating us on your podcast platform of choice. And as my mum always says, take great care and be vigilant out there.